Good morning, Magic. I'm Gavin Verhey from Wizards of the Coast, and we are finally doing it. We are releasing a set that combines Magic the Gathering with Dungeons and Dragons in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. But before we get into previews, how did we even get here in the first place? What groundwork needed to be laid to make this set happen? Well, let me tell you all about it today. Basically, as far back as I can remember, players have asked, when will we finally combine D&D and Magic? And especially in the past several years, as D&D has grown more mainstream thanks to things like Critical Role, I have got this question more than ever. When I started playing 20 years ago, people were asking the question. As I grew to become a Wizards employee, people kept asking the question, and even myself, I've asked the question numerous times. And it's because it just makes sense. It's just always seemed like a perfect fit. They've both got characters and spells and monsters and locations and cool artifacts. All the things you would want for a Magic set are in Dungeons and Dragons. But given all of that, it might then surprise you to learn that when I got to Wizards 10 years ago, there was a pretty strict rule. D&D was D&D and Magic was Magic, and never the twain shall meet. But then something happened. And with something like this, I never want to attribute it to just one person. It takes a lot of people and a lot of teams over a long duration to make something like this occur. But if I had to attribute it to one person who caused the change to begin and created the seeds for what we have today in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, that person would be James Wyatt. James Wyatt started at Wizards of the Coast all the way back in the year 2000, working on Dungeons and Dragons. And he stayed there for 14 years, learning the ins and outs of everything that had to do with D&D, before moving over to Magic. Now, when James moved into Magic, he carried his passion for D&D with him. And with Battle for Zendikar upcoming, and Zendikar a set that was originally built around D&D, he had an idea. What if he tried writing an adventure set in Zendikar? It made perfect sense. And as it turns out, if he was willing to write it, people would make it happen and get it online. And thus, the Plane Shift series was born. These were Dungeons and Dragons supplements released in an online PDF that then used the Art of Magic book, which James also wrote by the way, as a bit of a world guide for the setting. Plane Shift Zendikar definitely found an audience. Enough so that he once again created a labor of love with Plane Shift Innistrad. And that went well enough that we then did Plane Shift Kaladesh, Plane Shift Ixalan, and Plane Shift Dominaria. And as the popularity for the Plane Shift series continued to grow and grow and grow, and by the way, you can find all of those for free online if you want to go check them out, James's passion project was really given wings when the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica was greenlit. This was a full-on D&D book with everything you would need to run an adventure on Ravnica. Now, like I said before, it's never just one person, and even for these ideas, it took a lot of people and a lot of time to make them happen. But I do believe that without James Wyatt laying that initial groundwork, I don't know if Adventures in the Forgotten Realms would have turned out the same way it did today. So hats off to you, James. So players had been asking for the crossover for a long time, and James and everyone involved in the Plane Shift efforts had finally shown there was enough excitement around this. And the time we did sort of Dungeons and Dragons, well, players liked that card too. There was finally enough momentum inside the building, from R&D and Studio X where I work, all the way up to Chris Cox, the CEO, who is a huge fan of D&D, to make it happen. We were finally going to do it, the D&D Magic crossover set. And so, what would eventually go on to be called Project Zebra was born. Zebra because white and black stripes, two different things coming together, you get it. But there were still some big questions to answer. One of the largest ones, would this be its own standalone set, or would this be a standard legal release? And if it was a standard legal release, would it be a core set or its own thing? There was a lot that we investigated here and a lot of research that we did. And looking at both our preliminary designs for the set and a lot of the focus groups we talked with, it became more and more clear that this could be a standard legal set. And while I wasn't involved in the decision to have it replace the core set this year, it does make a lot of sense in many ways. For example, Dungeons and Dragons is a very trope-rich experience, full of all the kinds of spells and monsters that many people will recognize and be able to latch onto right away, even if they're a new player. But what happened next and what kind of cards did we make? Well, come back next week as I tell you all about it. In the meantime, though, if you have any questions about how the set came to be, let me know in the comments down below. I'll be back on Monday when I begin giving you some hints about what you can find in the set. In the meantime, though, may you have a lot of fun getting ready to go to the Forgotten Realms. You got this! Some of the good reasons are the following. Number 1, the card is extremely situational. For example, a card which is very good in some matchups and very bad in others. If you're going to do something like main deck color specific hate, 2 of is often a pretty good number for it. Reason number 2, the card is an expensive finisher.